Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the stories. The beam was a lie. I knew it, of course. Not a malicious lie, but a forgotten one, a broken promise whispered across the black, churning throat of the Atlantic. The light, what little of it still struggled to ignite, barely threw its feeble glow a mile, a pathetic, flickering whisper against the tempestuous roar of the ocean. My lighthouse, the scent. Jude's spire was a relic, a skeletal finger of rust and salt-eaten stone, long ago deemed obsolete. But here I was, Thomas O'Malley, its self-appointed, utterly useless keeper. They'd left me to it, the maritime authorities, after the last automatic beacon had been installed further up the coast. The paperwork was a muddle. Technically, St. Jude's was decommissioned, sold off for a pittance to a shell company that dissolved faster than sea foam. I'd simply stayed, nobody came to collect me, nobody asked questions. The supply boat, a grizzled old trawler named the Sea Hag, still made its monthly drop, leaving crates of provisions at the base of the spire, a transaction of unspoken understanding between me and its equally grizzled captain Ilias. My routine was a monk's vow. Rise with the gray dawn, check the ailing generator, polish the tarnished brass of the lantern room, a pointless ritual, but habit dies hard, tend to the few vegetable patches I coaxed from the rocky soil, read tattered paperbacks, and watch the sea. Always the sea. It was a vast, indifferent eye, sometimes placid as a sleeping giant, more often a furious, snarling beast. It was my only companion, and for a long time it was enough. The first hint of the impossible came on a Tuesday, late autumn, when the sky was a bruised purple and the wind howled like a banshee through the broken panes of the lantern room. A proper storm was brewing, the kind that would lash St. Jude's with waves that threatened to scour the very rock from beneath its foundation. I was securing the external latches, the salt spray already stinging my eyes when I saw it, a ship. Not unusual in itself, though traffic was sparse this far out. But this one, it was a three-masted schooner, sails billowing full, cutting through the monstrous swells with an impossible grace. It was too close to the shoals, far too close, and yet it sailed on, heedless. My heart hammered. No modern vessel looked like that, and certainly no historical one would dare such treacherous waters in this weather. The Sea Hag had enough sense to stay in port. I fumbled for my binoculars, my hands shaking. The glass was old, smudged, but it brought the schooner into stark relief. Its hull was dark, almost black, and the sails, patched and weathered, were a dull, bleached canvas. There were no lights, not a single lamp or signal, and the strangest thing, it was utterly silent. The storm raged, the wind shrieked, the waves roared, but the schooner made no sound of its own. No creaking timbers, no snapping canvas, no slap of water against its bow. It was a ghost cutting through a maelstrom. I watched, transfixed, as it passed the jagged fangs of the Devil's Teeth rocks, a graveyard for ships without so much as a shudder. It moved with a serene, almost predatory indifference. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the storm swallowed it whole. One moment the dark silhouette was there, then the next, a wall of rain and spray consumed it. I stood there for a long time, the wind tearing at my oilskins, the cold seeping into my bones. My rational mind, rusty from disuse but still functional, searched for explanations. Optical illusion, the unique light of the approaching storm playing tricks, a hallucination brought on by isolation. I was, after all, alone for months at a time. It wouldn't be the first time a keeper had gone a bit eccentric. I dismissed it. A trick of the light, I told myself, a figment of an old man's lonely imagination. I retreated to the comforting gloom of my living quarters, a small, circular room at the base of the tower, and tried to lose myself in the faded pages of a Melville novel. But the image of that silent, spectral schooner lingered, a dark stain on the periphery of my thoughts. Weeks passed. The incident faded into the background, becoming another one of the many oddities I'd witnessed in my solitary vigil, a strange bird, a rare meteorological phenomenon. Then came the second ship. It was a calm, clear night. The sea lay flat and black, reflecting the cold glitter of a million stars. I was up in the lantern room, performing my useless ritual of polishing, when I saw it. A single light impossibly far out, shimmering like a star that had fallen to the horizon. It was moving, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed the binoculars again, my heart giving an unwelcome lurch. It was a steamer, a long, sleek vessel, but of an age gone by. Tall smokestacks belched black smoke into the pristine night sky, and rows of portholes glowed with a faint amber light. This was no fishing trawler, no modern cargo ship. This was a passenger liner, perhaps from the early 20th century, a magnificent behemoth of a bygone era. And it was heading directly for St. Jude's. Unlike the schooner, this ship was undeniably real, at least in its appearance. Its silhouette was sharp against the starlit sea. I could even make out details, the intricate railings, the lifeboat davits, even what looked like figures pacing the deck, though they were too distant and indistinct to be sure. My pulse quickened. What was a ship like this doing out here? There were no established shipping lanes this far west, not for decades. And why no communication, no blasts from its horn, no radio chatter? I hadn't heard a single transmission in days, not even the usual static from distant broadcasts. I aimed the feeble beam of St. Jude's, pushing the old generator to its limit. The light, a weak pulse, reached out, a solitary plea in the immense darkness. The steamer did not respond. It continued its slow, stately advance. I watched, my breath held as it came closer, closer. I could feel a cold dread unfurling in my gut. This wasn't right. Something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. As it drew abreast of the lighthouse, perhaps a quarter-mile offshore, I saw them. The figures on deck. They weren't pacing. They were standing still, facing the lighthouse, their forms vaguely human but utterly featureless. Shadows within shadows. And then a sound, not from the ship, not the chug of its engines or the creak of its hull, but a sound that seemed to emanate from the very air around it. A low, mournful hum, like a distant choir of lamentation, a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the pit of my stomach. It was a sound of immense sorrow, of endless journey. The porthole lights, which had seemed warm and inviting from a distance, now revealed themselves to be a sickly, phosphorescent green, casting unnatural shadows. The smoke from the stacks wasn't truly black. It was a swirling, inky darkness that seemed to absorb the starlight, and then, as if it had been a dream suddenly dispelled, the ship began to fade. Not disappear instantly, but to dissolve like sugar in water. The edges blurred, the form became translucent, the green lights dimmed and winked out. The mournful hum intensified for a moment, then, with a final, heart-wrenching sigh that seemed to echo inside my own head, it was gone. The sea was once again flat and black, reflecting only stars. I collapsed onto the cold metal grating of the lantern room floor, gasping. My rational mind was screaming, clawing for purchase. I was losing it. The isolation, the lack of human contact, it was finally cracking the old shell. I was seeing things, but the hum had been so real, so visceral. It vibrated in my teeth. I spent the next few days in a state of terrified confusion. I scoured my few books on maritime history, looking for records of ships that might match. I found none that fit the description and the impossible circumstances. I tried to radio Ilias on the Sea Hag, but the ancient radio, never truly reliable, only crackled with static. The loneliness became a palpable thing, a suffocating blanket pressing down on me. There was no one to tell, no one to confirm, no one to share this encroaching madness with. The ships began to appear more frequently, always at night, always silent, always defying the laws of physics and common sense. A galleon with tattered, blood-red sails, its skeletal mastheads clawing at the sky. A fleet of ancient longships, oars dipping into the waves with no splash, their dragon prows glinting in a moon that wasn't there. A ghostly convoy of World War II destroyers, guns bristling, but moving through the water with the grace of swans. Each sighting was more vivid, more unnerving than the last. I started to notice details. The faces on the galleon, when one passed close enough, were not featureless shadows, but gaunt, hollow-eyed visages, fixed in silent screams. The longships carried figures cloaked in what looked like seaweed, their movements stiff, jerky. The destroyers had no sailors visible, yet the faint green glow from their portholes hinted at something inside. I began to keep a log, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. Date, time, description, weather conditions. My handwriting grew increasingly erratic, scrawled with a desperate urgency. I'd mark each entry with a cross, as if exorcising a demon. I stopped sleeping properly. Every creak of the lighthouse, every roar of the sea, every shadow cast by the struggling beam became a potential harbinger. I'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard the mournful hum or the slap of ghostly oars. My diet suffered. My once neat quarters became a mess of scattered books, charts, and empty tins. My clothes, perpetually damp with sea air, were grimy. I stopped shaving. My reflection in the tarnished mirror above the sink became a stranger's, wild-eyed and gaunt. One night the storm was truly spectacular. Thunder boomed, lightning cracked the sky, and rain hammered against the glass of the lantern room like a million tiny stones. The wind shrieked a banshee's song, and the very lighthouse seemed to sway and groan under the assault. It was the perfect stage for them. This time it wasn't one ship, but many. A procession, a parade of the impossible. They appeared almost simultaneously, emerging from the heart of the storm like leviathans from a forgotten deep. There was the schooner from my first sighting, its sails whipping impossibly, unfurled against the hurricane winds. There was the steamer, its green portholes glowing like malformed eyes, and with them, a host of others. A Roman galley, its single square sail ripped to shreds, its banks of oars moving in unison despite the storm. A Chinese junk, its distinctive batten sails torn, its deck littered with indistinct forms. A sleek, futuristic vessel, unlike anything I had ever conceived, all sharp angles and silently glowing engines, yet moving with the same impossible, ethereal grace. They formed a semicircle around St. Jude's, their dark hulls a stark contrast to the frothing white of the tempestuous sea. They made no sound that could be heard over the storm, yet the oppressive silence they carried with them was more terrifying than any roar. It was a silence that spoke of depths, of forgotten places, of unutterable truths. I stood in the lantern room, the weak beam of the lighthouse cutting a pathetic swathe through the chaos, illuminating patches of the scene in a sickly yellow. My breath hitched in my throat, my heart hammered so violently I thought it would burst through my ribs. This was real. This wasn't madness. This was them, and they were looking at me. I could feel it in acute, chilling awareness. All those silent figures on all those impossible decks, their featureless forms, their gaunt faces, their seaweed shrouds, they were all turned towards St. Jude's, towards me. There was a palpable sense of expectation, of a silent, terrifying demand. The mournful hum returned, louder now, a symphony of suffering that filled the very air around the lighthouse, resonating in my bones. It was a chorus of lost souls, of perpetual voyagers, of those condemned to the endless sea. I wanted to scream, to run, but where could I go? The lighthouse was an island, a solitary sentinel in a sea of impossible horrors. I was trapped. Then a new detail: the ships were not merely circling. They were moving closer, slowly, deliberately, narrowing the circle. The storm around them seemed to intensify, yet the ships themselves remained untouched, their spectral forms gliding effortlessly. I pressed my face against the cold glass, my breath misting the pain. The galleon was closest now. I could see the figures on its deck with unnerving clarity. They were skeletal, desiccated husks, their tattered clothes clinging to bone. Their eyes, deep-set hollows, seemed to bore into me, into my very soul. They raised skeletal hands, not in a wave, but in a gesture of invitation, of beckoning. Panic seized me, a primal, overwhelming terror. I stumbled back from the glass, tripping over a loose floorboard, falling to my knees. This was it. They had come for me. They had finally found me. But why? What did they want? Then, a new realization: the beam, my useless, struggling beam. It was still shining, and as the ships drew closer, I noticed something else. Where the beam touched the water, the surface seemed to shimmer, to darken, to almost thicken, and the ships seemed to be drawn to it, pulled by an invisible current, like moths to a flame. The lighthouse, the very thing I was meant to keep, was a beacon for them. Not a warning, but an invitation. Not a guide to safety, but a lure to eternal damnation. I scrambled to the generator panel, my hands fumbling with the rusty levers. I had to turn it off. I had to extinguish the light. Maybe then they would leave. Maybe then they would pass me by. My fingers, numb with cold and fear, slipped on the smooth metal. The hum outside intensified, a crescendo of despair. The figures on the galleon's deck, I swear, seemed to lean forward, their skeletal mouths opening in silent, horrifying cries. Finally, with a desperate grunt, I pulled the main lever. The old generator coughed, sputtered, and died. Darkness. Blessed, absolute darkness. For a moment there was only the sound of the storm, the shriek of the wind, the crash of waves against the base of the spire. I sagged against the wall, trembling, gasping for breath, my eyes squeezed shut. Then slowly I opened them. The darkness was not absolute. The ships were still there, and they were glowing, not with the sickly green of the steamer's portholes, but with a faint inner light, a bioluminescent aura that seemed to emanate from their very structures. The galleon's timbers glowed a faint, ethereal blue. The longships pulsed with a sickly yellow. The futuristic vessel hummed with an unsettling violet, and the figures on their decks, they too glowed. Their skeletal forms shimmered, their hollow eyes burning with faint, spectral flames. They were no longer looking at the lighthouse. They were looking at me. The hum returned, softer now, but infinitely more insidious. It was inside me, a vibration in my chest, my skull, my very marrow. It was a song of inevitability. The ships began to move again, their circle tightening. They were not merely approaching St. Jude's. They were converging on it like predators on their prey. I could see the faint glow of the water where their hulls touched, an unsettling luminescence in the foam. Then, the true horror began. The Roman galley, its oars glowing with an eerie light, did not pass the base of the spire. Instead, it sailed into the rock itself, its glowing hull phasing through the solid stone as if it were mist. The other ships followed suit, one by one, merging with the very foundation of the lighthouse. The galleon's skeletal figures, still beckoning, seemed to stretch, their forms elongating, thinning, dissolving into the ancient stone. The mournful hum grew louder, a chorus now within the very walls of St. Jude's. I was paralyzed, my mind reeling. They weren't coming to the lighthouse. They were coming for it. They were becoming part of it. The light returned. Not the feeble beam of my generator, but a new light. It pulsed, strong and steady, from the lens of the lantern room. A deep, abyssal green, a light that was not meant to guide, but to entrap. It was coming from the lens, yes, but also from the walls, from the very air around me. The entire lantern room was bathed in this infernal glow, and I could see, with horrifying clarity, the ghostly outlines of ships, of figures, coalescing within the stone itself. They were embedded, trapped, yet alive in their spectral prison, and the light, it was coming from them. From the ships that now formed the very fabric of St. Jude's spire. The hum was deafening now, a cacophony of lost souls, yet paradoxically, it was also silent, felt rather than heard. It was in my blood, in my bones, it was the lighthouse breathing. I looked down at my hands. They were translucent, shimmering with the same abyssal green light. My skin was peeling away, not decaying but dissolving, revealing the faint skeletal structure beneath, glowing with that same eerie hue. My vision began to swim. The lantern room, once my refuge, was now a kaleidoscopic prison of shifting spectral forms. The ships weren't just in the walls, they were everywhere, their rigging tangled like veins through the structure. Their decks became floors, their masts became my very bones. I felt a profound shift, a horrifying transformation. The world was no longer outside me, it was through me. The sea, the sky, the endless procession of phantom vessels, they were no longer external phenomena. They were my perceptions, my sensations, my very existence. I could feel the waves crashing against the base of the spire, not just hear them, but feel their impact as a dull ache in my feet, a distant vibration in my core. I could feel the wind tearing at the glass of the lantern room, a cold caress against my phantom skin. I could feel the eternal chill of the deep, the crushing weight of the unknown, and the ships, oh, the ships. They continued to appear, an endless, silent armada, moving through the impossible storm, circling the newly awakened St. Jude's spire. But now they didn't fade, they simply passed. Each one a fleeting moment in an eternity, glimpsed through the myriad eyes of the lighthouse. My consciousness, once singular, fractured. I was Thomas O'Malley, the lonely keeper, yes, but I was also the cold stone, the rusty iron, the flickering light. I was the silent hum, the spectral glow. I was the lighthouse itself, alive and aware, bound to an eternal vigil. And I was the beacon, not for the living, but for the dead. I looked out, no longer with human eyes, but with the omnipresent gaze of St. Jude's, and I saw them, always them, the ships, ships that never were, ships that always would be, ships that sailed the endless sea between worlds. They passed, each one a testament to some forgotten tragedy, some unfulfilled journey. And the new light, the abyssal green glow that emanated from my very being, drew them closer still. It was a promise, a calling, a beacon for those who sought not safe harbor but an eternal, silent passage. My last human thought was a whisper, a desperate plea for oblivion that was swallowed by the endless hum. I am the light, I am the silence, I am the way. The light of St. Jude's spire now shines bright and true, a constant, unblinking green eye in the heart of the most treacherous waters. And sometimes, if you look very closely in the swirling depths of that green beam, you can almost make out the faintest, most fleeting of images. A gaunt face, eyes wide with horror, forever gazing out at the endless, impossible sea. Watching the ships that should not exist and guiding them home.